Economic factors of adaptive reuse. Adaptive reuse is the process of taking an old building or site and reusing it for a purpose other than it was designed, while keeping its historic features. It is also known as recycling or conversion. These buildings are usually located in the center of cities and were probably once a greatly visited location. The detailing found in these buildings are usually unique to the times they were constructed, even though they have deteriorated in some way. This is something that can't be seen in modern building design. These features are often emphasized in the new use and preserved instead of getting hauled off to landfills. The details are what will offer a unique site for the new occupant. Even though it is a good way to preserve heritage buildings, there are many issues that arises when we talk about adaptive reuse. Funding, for example, is a dominant factor that affects the preservation of heritage buildings. One of the main problems faced when adaptive reuse is considered is the funding and cost. This is because it is very difficult to predict an approximate value, and a new building is much more economical to construct. A lot of factors such as development costs, project costs, investment returns, and market demand play a role in affecting the price of adaptive reuse. This study is conducted to explore the factors that affect the cost of adaptive reuse. Conceptual framework of our study. Adaptive reuse is broken down into 4 different factors. What is adaptive reuse? A reuse of an old building for a new purpose, to preserve cultural heritage and to preserve architectural style, which in turn preserves the identity of Malaysia. Skeptical factor to adaptive reuse: the reliability, the costs, the heritage value, the environment and safety requirements. Economic effects to context: it increases property value nearby, increases local tourism, increases commercial activities. The costs: it is costlier than common renovations, and it requires specific methods and materials, thus increases the costs unpredictably. There are 5 main research questions for the study conducted. Question 1. What is adaptive reuse? Question 2. Why are people skeptical about adaptively reusing a building? Question 3. How does adaptive reuse affect the economic development of its context? Question 4. How do materials and building techniques used in old heritage buildings, along with maintenance, affect the cost of adaptive reuse? And question 5. How does adaptive reuse affect Taman Budaya? What is adaptive reuse? Adaptive reuse is to meet halfway between history and modernization. A certain country, place, or structure have started to create its own story and carved a relevance in history they've enrooted themselves in, collective memory, and indirectly generated it. As we travel every day and reach other places, we can see that there are unique qualities that a certain city or country has. Even if we have realized that some have similar languages, culture, and way of living, there still is one thing that you can find in a place but not the other. that is brought by the influence and significance of the past. These are antiques, anchors from the past, and yet as for now have been placed in interiors of modern buildings as accents, thus recovering elements from our forefathers for generations to come. This is what we call adaptive reuse. Why are people skeptical about adaptively reusing a building? Adaptive reuse projects usually result in a positive impact, but at most of the time we choose to have new construction rather than adaptive reusing an old building. Why are people skeptical about adaptively reusing a building? Because it is costly. Developers must put in a lot of effort to renovate or will damage the building's value if they work without proper renovation skills. As an old building, renovation will face issues of troublesome hazardous materials to frustrating out-of-date building codes, age safety features to difficult vulnerabilities, and entirely replacement of electrical and plumbing to ensure the system is safe and functional. So it may cost a lot of time and money compared to new projects. That's why it may not profit. How does adaptive reuse affect the economic development of the context? Adaptive reuse has been shown to increase land value and property prices in Hong Kong. It is attracting local tourism and commercial activities. Other than providing shelter, they also manifest the local cultural and historical characteristics which define communities. Based on a research done by University of Malaysia, shows majority of people have positive opinions on adaptive reuse of heritage buildings in Kuala Lumpur City. This paper argues that the adaptive reuse of heritage buildings increases the value of residential properties within the district and revitalizes the area economically and culturally because of the positive externalities generated from the cultural heritage. Materials, building techniques, and maintenance's effect on the cost of adaptive reuse. The costs associated with reusing existing structures are frequently high and more difficult to predict than new development projects. This is because it requires specific methods and special building materials. Furthermore, very few contractors have the skills and knowledge required to restore and conserve heritage buildings, and custom products may only have a few vendors available to provide bids, which can reduce competition and increase the price. Maintenance work can also be very expensive, especially if the structure is too old or fragile. Effects of adaptive reuse in Taman Budaya. The building has been through several changes in its purpose and design since its original conceptions. The original first building had burned down in 1999, but had now been restored magnificently and bestowed heritage status and handed over to the National Culture and Arts Department, Federal Territory. The restoration process took 3 years to complete from 2002 to 2005, with a cost of 7 million ringgit. The building is equipped with basic amenities that are essential to its development of artistic and cultural heritage. The institution was moved to Petaling Hill because they needed more space to accommodate the increasing number of students and to avoid the flood that started around 1926. The building was repurposed as a training center for arts. The redevelopment of Taman Budaya has been undertaken by the government and is now equipped with state-of-the-art technology and equipment to meet the requirements and cultural and artistic development under the administration of the Kuala Lumpur Federal Cultural and Arts Department. In conclusion, the purpose of this study is to look deeper into investigating the enhancement of adaptive reuse approach to historical buildings, not only to the surrounding environment, but also to the economic development of the country. Oftentimes, adaptive reuse and restoration projects occur in buildings that have been standing empty for years. Adaptive reuse is the way forward and has more advantages than disadvantages. Even though it is costly, adaptive reuse is the way to attract tourists and advance the tourism industry of Malaysia. Tourists highly acknowledge the practices of adaptive reuse of the historical buildings. Their positive behavior is evident when most of the tourists perceive the adaptive reuse of the historical buildings influence their level of appreciation and subsequently translate it into their actual visitation. The adaptive reuse of historical buildings can be marketed as a heritage tourism product. Adaptive reuse will also increase the land and property value of that specific place. Adaptive reuse preserves the cultural aspect of Malaysia and portrays traditions and identity. Adaptive reuse is an excellent initiative as it is not only preserving the historical treasures for future generations but is a catalyst for tourism development and helps to generate income for the community. Thank you.